Hi, I'm Niall Stanage from The Hill, and you're welcome to our latest conversation. I'm joined today by our own Laura Kelly, the foreign policy staff writer here at The Hill. Laura has previously reported from numerous trouble spots and conflict zones, including northern Iraq, Israel, and the Gaza Strip. She has only just returned from an 11-day reporting trip in Ukraine amid the Russian invasion. And now she's here to talk about it. Laura, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start off with very big picture stuff. What's your impression of who is actually winning this war right now?
I think the best assessment is that the Ukrainians are in a very delicate position that is at a critical point. They're in this war of attrition and they need to break out of it. And when I was there, it was the 6-month mark of the war, and the Ukrainians were putting to use the US provided and Western provided heavy artillery to begin to clear the way for what they hope they can launch as a counteroffensive. And they've said in the last couple of days that they are beginning this counteroffensive in the south particularly, but it's unclear yet if that's in full force or maybe they're just trying to send some messages to the Russians. But from my conversations in Kyiv, it seems that this is a really critical point in the war. 6 months is a very long time for the entire country to feel under this tension of war, where maybe the pace of attacks from the Russians is not in the vein as the first few weeks, but still it's unclear where it's going to go.
And just on that point where you talk about, the 6 months and the fact that it is enduring is at a kind of pivotal point, what's your feeling from conversations either with Ukrainian officials or Ukrainian people generally about morale, about their spirit? I mean, are they very battered down at this stage, or do they feel optimistic about the future?
Generally, it was optimistic. Generally, it was determined. Really great, a really great feeling there. Actually, there were times where you could kind of forget that the war was. I hate to say to forget that the war was happening or feel like it's normal or something, but in any situation, you find a way to live. And we would joke and we would laugh and we would sometimes use dark humor to get through the days. So I would say that the spirit of the people is definitely high, and they're very much determined and very patriotic and very, I think, unified and solidified and still great respect and great admiration for Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Obviously, when people are looking at this from the outside, primarily in the US, I think there's a lot of curiosity about just the practicalities of life and even the practicalities for a reporter in covering this conflict. How do you get into Ukraine?
Well, before I arrived there, I applied for press credentials so that I could work as a journalist in the country, and I was granted that. And from there, just I booked the flight. And for my travel, I really wanted to focus on Odessa as the center of this international food crisis, where right before I arrived, a few weeks before I arrived, the Russians had agreed to let Ukrainian grain shipments leave the port of Odessa. So I thought this was a really critical point for me to begin my trip. And to do that, I flew from the US, transited in Istanbul, Turkey, and then flew into Moldova. And from Moldova, I had hired a woman who served as my fixer, who helped me organize kind of my itinerary in Odessa. So she met me at the airport of Moldova, and then we drove into Ukraine. So the drive, I think, is about 3 hours normally, but at the border checkpoint, we spent about 2.5 hours waiting for, I don't know what we were waiting for. I fell asleep because it was a very long trip.
The nervousness wasn't getting to you too much then at that stage.
And so then we drove into Ukraine, and the drive to Odessa was fascinating for me. We took some backcountry roads to avoid some traffic. I guess it was a good thing to see that there was a lot of traffic going into Moldova and from Moldova, showing that more exports were moving in that sense, and movement of people as well. And as we were driving on these kind of back roads, we stopped in a small village where a man was selling grapes outside of his home, and we just bought some local grapes, and it was a very nice time.
Talking of things like that, the normal life happening in juxtaposition to a war going on, was that the most surprising or striking thing? Like, were there things that you saw, or even atmosphere that you picked up on, that was different from what you had expected before you went there?
It's hard for me to say exactly. I lived 4 years in Israel, so I had lived under this sense of, especially air raid sirens. My 4 years in Israel, we went through periods of war where Hamas in the Gaza Strip was firing rockets onto Israel. We would have air raid sirens. But what was different for me in Ukraine was that it's a totally different sense of understanding of the rocket threat, and Ukrainians didn't really go to bomb shelters when the air raid sirens went off. I was a little unsure of what really we should be doing. There were no bomb shelters really. It was mostly basements, and it was a thought of, do I go to the basement? Because if a rocket hits the building and the building collapses, then I'm stuck in a basement under all this rubble. So some of the advice I got was to go out onto the street. So it was a bit weird in that sense. My biggest takeaway was that it's this overall sense of tension. And I remember this from my time living in Israel too, where you go about your daily life, but you realize that you have a heaviness on you, you have an anxiety in you, and it's that you never know when this air raid siren is going to go off. And there was a point where I was in Kyiv, and it was Independence Day, and I had just done some reporting in the center of the city, interviewing some people, and I was rushing to a restaurant to write up that report and send it back to Washington. And the restaurant wouldn't allow people to sit inside for the risk of air raid sirens. And then as I was sitting outside, I have this beautiful plate delivered to me. It's tuna tartare, a little glass of wine, and then the air raid siren goes off.
Right.
And it's just this feeling of sadness, of a bit of fear, of not sure, is this the air raid siren that really means a missile attack is going to happen where I am? But yeah, you just wait it out.
Yeah, no, I know, and I know from my own past experience many years ago, there is that oddity. I was in Israel and the West Bank around the time of the Second Intifada, and there's normal life on one hand, and yet the possibility that something catastrophic could happen at any second, and there's a weird duality to that, right?
Yeah, you just kind of take it on yourself that you prepare for these things. I normally sleep with earplugs, and I thought I shouldn't sleep with earplugs in Ukraine, because if an air raid siren goes off at night, I have to be able to hear it. And I went out for a run in the morning in Kyiv, and the air raid sirens went off when I was on my run. I had one headphone in so that I could hear it if it went off, and you just kind of modify your life.
Moving from the more direct or personal into the bigger picture, when you spoke, I know you spoke, for example, to an aide to President Zelensky. How vital is American assistance in their mind? Is that everything pretty much in terms of the winning or losing of the war, or what's their view?
Yes. What I want to say is that they understand the audience. They understood they were talking to an American reporter, and so they were very grateful. They were very thankful. And everyone I spoke to, the first thing that they said was like, thank you so much for the assistance. And the assistance is imperative because it's allowing them to have these bigger attacks against Russia and compete with Russia's overwhelming artillery. But with that thanks and that gratitude, there's also the sense of, I don't know if the word is frustration, but kind of like shaking the West, like, thank you so much, but you have to do this, because if we fall, you fall. So thank you, but it's necessary. Thank you, but like, this is your fight too, and you should be doing everything you need to do to make sure that we survive, because if we fall, you're next. So that was my general sense.
And related to that, is there a fearfulness in your judgment of either the American public losing interest or the American body politic becoming less willing to provide that level of aid? I mean, is that something that's on the radar of Ukrainians?
I asked that question, and it's something that they definitely follow. They follow how Russia's war in Ukraine in general has fallen from the headlines and fallen from people's attention. But the way that they explained it to me was that they're so focused on their relationships and communication with the governments, and they feel that support and that understanding is very strong. So when I ask questions about, how do you feel if there's a change in political leadership in the U.S. with political parties and things, they were very comfortable with saying that they believe the bipartisan support is strong and that the policy transcends politics. Whether they were saying that just to project strength, I could never tell, but that's the message that they gave me.
War reporting is difficult by its nature. It's logistically difficult. It can be physically dangerous for obvious reasons. It can be emotionally difficult. One of the difficulties, it seems to me, in terms of getting the full story out is that an actual war is different from political wars here, where you call a Republican and then you call a Democrat. You don't have the capacity covering something like the war in Ukraine to just say, well, I'll walk over to the Russian lines and see how things are here. So did you feel that the Ukrainian people who were talking to you were basically telling you the truth, or did you get any sense where people were making claims that you were skeptical or suspicious of?
I would say probably the truth, and then there was also the sense that if somebody told me something, it was likely that I could try and verify it pretty easily, because there's so much open reporting, there's so much open source, and people were generally accessible and open with their time and with their insights. So, this trip, the Ukrainian officials, I feel, have been very very prominent in talking and being open to the press and things like that. And there's a lot of media in Ukraine in general, international media and local media, and so these 11 days, I really wanted to focus on the on the ground and the experience there, because it was something that the rest of the reporting on the phone or through text message or things like that, I tried to do as much as possible before I arrived there, and figured I would definitely do a lot when I got back.
Right. The issue of how you were treated, not by people who you were interviewing, but just in day-to-day life. I mean, obviously there is a significant media presence there, so I assume people have become accustomed to the presence of journalists and reporters. But how were you treated in day-to-day as you went about your business? I mean, what was people's reaction toward you?
I had organized a lot of my interviews and what I wanted to achieve beforehand, so I did have a lot of structured days. But there was an instance where I went to the city of Mykolaiv, which is under heavy Russian bombardment, and we went to a water distribution event. It was a volunteer initiative where volunteers from Odessa came in to give drinking water to the residents of Mykolaiv, because they've been without drinking water since April. And we tried to talk to some of the residents, and it was usually the younger people that didn't want to speak to an American journalist.
Really?
Yeah, and then the older people who are very open with their time. I spoke with this one older woman named Valentina, and she must have been in her 80s or 90s and had talked about her experience surviving World War II and now living under the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and she was very open with us. But the rest of the people that day seemed to mostly be wanting to get back and get on with their days. Mykolaiv Mykolaiv was tense in general. But I also found in some of the last minute things or spur of the moment things, people would maybe say no at first, and then they would go ahead and give me an interview. Or we went to the zoo, and in Mykolaiv, that was closed because there's so few people there. They open on the weekends, and the zoo director was there, and we said, can we get a tour? And he said no, and then we talked for a little bit, and he said, okay, let me show you around, and we got a full tour of the zoo.
Right. Were the animals there? Like, were
there were some animals there, and of course, and the zoo actually got hit by rockets, and one of the rockets landed outside the bear enclosure, and they cemented the rocket into the ground where it landed as kind of like a memorial or museum artifact, and they've collected different rockets that have landed in the zoo. They made a little joke that the rocket, behind the rocket was a sign that said, like, danger to your life if you pass this barrier into the bear enclosure. And they said, even the Russians are scared of the bears. But also, as I was there, an air raid siren sounded in Mykolaiv, and the bear had come out of its enclosure, and the bear was just walking around like nothing was bothering it. And but we did go around we saw some monkeys, and they seemed pretty agitated over the air raid sirens.
Can't have the animals being affected by these things in that way. On the bigger political picture, and forgive me if this is an ignorant question, but obviously Russia and Ukraine have long historic links, and there are people who live in Ukraine who are ethnic Russians and all of that. Did you encounter Ukrainians who were at all sympathetic to Russia, or was that just not viable? I mean, obviously when you're under bombardment, you're not going to be sympathetic. But in general, did you meet anyone who had sort of pro-Russian sentiments?
Personally, I did not, but the people that I spoke with, they shared some experiences they have of speaking with their family members who live in Russia or Belarus, or sometimes in the occupied territories, and they explained to me different instances of how maybe those relatives were fine living under Russian occupation, or if they're in Russia, or if they're in Belarus, they don't think that Russia has invaded Ukraine. They don't see the atrocities that Russia has committed, and I'm not sure exactly how many of these stories I can tell because they just kind of happened in conversation. But it was understandable, I think, if we look at a lot of the reporting of the propaganda in Russia, and if we reflect on our own experiences in the U.S. and the political polarization, and how people can look at one event and see completely different aspects of it. So that was kind of the sense that I got.
Did you get any sense in any of those conversations, again without breaching confidence or whatever, I mean, are there moral complexities to this conflict, or is it the Ukrainians the good guys v the Russians who are the bad guys?
On, from whose perspective? Well,
from yours.
From my perspective, I mean, I guess it's kind of a dangerous way to look at it as a reporter. I mean, objectively, from what we've seen, Russia invaded a sovereign nation with no justification, and the Ukrainians are pushing back, fighting for their survival. And all of the reporting of the atrocities that Russia is said to have committed, if we look at good and evil on that side, I mean, it does remind me of when we were looking at the fight against ISIS, and that was so clearly good and evil. Maybe because it wasn't a state it wasn't a state. Russia is a state, so one of the confusing aspects of it, and is something that the entire world is going to have to deal with, is how do you deal with Russia after this war? And just today, the European Union has imposed a visa suspension for Russian citizens to come into the EU. And this was a very difficult decision for them because they're weighing what can be criticized as collective punishment against the Russian people. And it makes you, the world will have to grapple with, is it how we're trying to deal with the Russian government without punishing the Russian people. But there's this weird dynamic where the Russian people are under this intense propaganda by the Russian government, and what responsibility do they bear? So it's a very, very difficult situation.
Having spent the time that you did there, are there things, is there one thing that you would want Americans who have not necessarily followed every twist and turn of this conflict to know? Or was there one thing that stood out for you as surprising, or that you know, what would be one key thing that you now know that you didn't before your trip there?
I do have to say, I hope this doesn't sound shallow, but you know, Kyiv was just an absolutely gorgeous city, and there was so much life and so much culture and so much character. And I joked a little bit that a lot of the photos that I was sending my family and friends who were concerned about my safety while I was there, that it looked like I was on vacation, because it's a beautiful country. They have so many amenities. You know, restaurants were still open and stuff, lots of hotels. And, you know, in conversations with the residents, it's like, for example, I was speaking with this one young man who was originally from Bucha, and we met in Kyiv, and he described to me that Bucha was, you know, this beautiful place to live. It's a suburb of Kyiv, upper middle class, and now it's just completely associated with the darkest images that we can possibly imagine. And he said, how is this happening? We are a civilized country. Like, this is Europe. We're not Syria. We're not Africa. And it's not great to make those kind of comparisons, because violence like this and war like this should not happen anywhere. But it just shows the level of the shockingness that these kind of atrocities are happening in what's considered a modern place. And there's so much that we don't know, and it feels like things, definitely in the US, as the stories of Ukraine have dropped below the headlines, I think it's easy to think that things are well taken care of, things are moving at some sort of pace, but there's so much we don't know about what's happening in the occupied territories, or just how people are suffering on a day-to-day basis, or even how people are trying to rebuild and pick up their lives again. I went to a center in Odessa with refugees from Mariupol who were providing assistance to other refugees from Mariupol. And, you know, it's something that even people in Odessa probably don't pay that much attention to, but it's a real hardship and a real crisis. And, you know, this is just something that's going to go on for a very, very, very long time.
It is clearly a real crisis, and you mentioned about people here in the States inquiring about your well-being and all of that, or you mentioned earlier on about the air raid sirens. Did you think you were in actual danger yourself at specific points, or did you mostly avoid obvious peril?
It's hard to say, and probably my family wouldn't be too happy if I I mean,
we're just having a conversation among friends here, Laura. Just say it.
I like to think that I have a good sense of maybe what's a possibly dangerous situation and what's not. I did travel like along the front line, where we didn't go exactly to the point of contact, but we were only a few miles away. And I was going back over my notes, and I realized I was sitting in a cafe I mean, cafe. It was the only place open in this tiny village where we got to meet with the military commander. And we heard booms, and I said, "What is that?" And he says, "That's the volley of artillery where the Russians are attacking us, and we are sending back rockets, missiles from M777s from the U.S. and HIMARS." And I thought, oh well, if I can hear it, it's probably not a good sign. And I drove on a lot of darkened roads at night. I was invited to travel along with a volunteer group that was providing donations to frontline soldiers, and they had permission to travel at night. And as I looked out the window of the car, and it's totally black, we were in the east of the country, I could see explosions in the distance. I couldn't hear them, so I took that as a good sign. Right. And when I was in Odessa, there was a rocket attack, and it didn't hit the center of the city, but it hit a few miles away. And I guess sometimes it's just the luck of the draw where you are. When I traveled to Mykolaiv, that city had come under rocket attack over the past couple days, and they ended up hitting the same university twice in 2 days. I don't know why, whether it was intentional or they just had bad aim, but a good coincidence. So yeah, it's hard to tell. Obviously there's dangers, but I try to tell people, it's dangerous in the US too.
Sure. Well, we're glad to have you back. We appreciate all your reporting from there, and we appreciate you dropping by for this conversation. So, Laura Kelly, thank you.
Thank you.